The Akkadian kings took control of all of northern Mesopotamia and spread their culture throughout the region, reaching as far as the Zagros Mountains. The Semitic nomads lived around the cities alongside the settled local people. Among these nomads were the Assyrians, who later built a great empire. The rule of the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, which had lasted for 1,500 years, had ended, but Sumerian culture remained influential. While the Akkadian language became the common language of the people, the royal court, priests, and scholars continued to speak Sumerian. During the Sumerian period, Mesopotamia was ruled by city-states. However, in later centuries, these small kingdoms transformed into large, powerful empires with major capitals. One of the most influential of these was the Assyrian Empire, which spread its culture as far as Anatolia and even Syria. After the fall of Sumerian dominance, new groups arrived in Mesopotamia. The Amorites, a Semitic people from the Syrian and Arabian deserts, settled in the region and took control. They had already been migrating into Mesopotamia for a long time, working as farm laborers and serving as mercenary soldiers in the Sumerian army. Alongside attacks from the Elamites in the east, the Amorites played a key role in ending Sumerian rule. After conquering the Sumerian cities, the Amorites settled down and became the ruling class. Over time, they adopted Sumerian laws, beliefs, and culture, integrating fully into society. While the people spoke a Semitic language, Sumerian continued to be used in schools and temples. By the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, the Amorites blended into the older Semitic populations, adopting the Akkadian language. Around this time, a new wave of migrants, the Arameans, arrived from Syria and Palestine, seeking the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Assyrians were originally semi-nomadic Semitic people who lived near Sumerian and Akkadian cities. They had migrated south from Syria and Palestine. By the 2nd millennium BC, they founded a city called Ashur on the banks of the Tigris River, and their rulers called themselves Ish-Shiakum. Their homeland, later called Assyria, was known in Sumerian texts as Subur or Subir, and in Akkadian as Subartu. The Assyrians first became known for their military campaigns during the reign of their king Elishuma, who attacked Babylon. Under Elishuma, Assyria expanded and started becoming more powerful. He was the grandson of an Akkadian governor who had established a dynasty in Ashur. However, a generation before Hammurabi's rule, this Akkadian dynasty was overthrown by Shamshi-Adad, another Assyrian ruler. The early history of Assyrian kings is not well documented, but an Assyrian king list from the 8th century BC mentions 17 early kings who lived in tents, showing their nomadic origins. Some of these kings had Canaanite names, meaning they were not originally of Semitic origin. During Shamshi-Adad's rule, the Assyrians expanded their influence into Lebanon and Palestine, taking control of some Mediterranean trade routes. Their borders reached as far south as Babylon and the city of Eshnunna. Around this time, the Assyrians also started establishing trade centers in Anatolia. Most of what we know about the Assyrians in Anatolia comes from clay tablets discovered at Kultepe, near modern Kayseri. These documents, written in Old Assyrian script, record 3 generations of Assyrian traders. The first Assyrian trading colony in this area was founded under Elishuma's rule. His son Irisum and grandson Sharumkin continued these trade activities. The most important Assyrian trade center in Anatolia was called Kanish, where is modern-day Kultepe. Archaeologists have found thousands of clay tablets here, detailing business contracts, court decisions, trade agreements, and tax records. The Assyrians established trade centers called Karum, which had branches connected to Kanish. These centers handled trade and disputes, but the Assyrians had no political power in Anatolia. They had to pay taxes to local rulers. Mesopotamian civilization was technologically and culturally advanced, but lacked natural resources. The Assyrians traded with Anatolia for tin, copper, and silver, paying for these materials with textiles and precious stones. Other Assyrian trade archives were found at Hattusa and Ankua. These documents detail prices, profits, losses, annual trade balances, loans, and the incomes of different trade centers. However, the Assyrians did not contribute much to Anatolia's cultural development at this time. While they brought writing to Anatolia, their influence was limited because they were mainly focused on trade. Over time, political instability in Anatolia and increasing dangers on trade routes caused Assyrian merchants to gradually leave the region. The collapse of their trade networks weakened their presence in Anatolia. Later, when the Hittites began using writing, they adopted Mesopotamian cuneiform script through contacts in Syria. After the Hittites destroyed Babylon in 1594 BC, power in Mesopotamia shifted to new groups. The Kassites took control of Babylon, while the Hittites expanded westward toward the Aegean Sea. Meanwhile, the Hurrians established the powerful Mitanni kingdom, which stretched from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean. The competition for resources like metals, timber, and access to Mediterranean ports led to conflicts between these kingdoms. While the ruling elite enjoyed luxury, ordinary people suffered under high taxes and harsh labor conditions. Each conquest only increased social tensions as newly enslaved populations rebelled against their oppressors. After Shamshi-Adad and his sons, Assyria's influence weakened. The Assyrian trade network in Anatolia collapsed, and Assyria fell under Mitanni control. During this period, Assyrian rulers were essentially governors under the Mitanni king and referred to themselves as Ish-Shakum, meaning high priest of the god Ashur. Despite Mitanni dominance, there were periods of Assyrian independence. For example, in the early 14th century BC, King Puzur-Ashur III made a border agreement with the Kassite king Bernaburiash of Babylon. Later, another Kassite king, Karendash, made a treaty recognizing Assyria's borders. These agreements suggest that Assyria still had some political influence. The Mitanni kingdom ruled through local governors who enforced heavy taxes and strict control over the population. One such Mitanni-controlled city was Arapha, which was strategically located between Assyria and Babylonia. Archaeologists have found over 15,000 Akkadian language tablets in Arapha, belonging to a wealthy Hurrian family. These documents show that the Hurrian elite controlled the land and oppressed the local Semitic population. Hurrian nobles expanded their estates by buying up land, while the common people lost their land and had to work as laborers. Court cases over land disputes always favored the wealthy Hurrians, making them even richer. Despite being ruled by the Mitanni, these Hurrian-controlled regions maintained trade ties with Babylon. Hurrian rulers sent gifts and goods to Babylon to maintain friendly relations and ensure economic stability. Over time, the Mitanni kingdom began to weaken due to rebellions. Hurrian dominance and Mitanni unity weakened. After the death of the Mitanni king Shutarna and the death of the king who succeeded him, the Assyrians tried to take advantage of the resulting chaos. The Assyrian king Ashur-uballit I established diplomatic relations with Egypt and even received the same respect from the pharaoh that was shown to the Mitanni king. However, for the Assyrians to gain their independence, they first had to break free from Hurrian control. According to documents found in excavations in the city of Ashur, Hurrian influence was increasing in Assyrian society. In land sales, Hurrian names frequently appeared among buyers, sellers, witnesses, and guarantors. Hurrians who married Assyrian women gave Hurrian names to their children. Likewise, Assyrians who married Hurrian women also gave Hurrian names to their children. Religious changes also began to appear. Foreign gods became part of Assyrian beliefs. For example, the great Hurrian god Teshub was adopted into Assyrian and Akkadian beliefs under the name Adad. The value of land in sales was measured and paid in tin. The Hurrians, who controlled the rich tin and iron trade in Anatolia, could easily buy land in Assyrian territories. As beliefs, traditions, and society became more Hurrian, wealth and private property began to concentrate in the hands of the Hurrians. As we have mentioned earlier, the Mitanni king Shutarna died, and the new king who succeeded him was also killed. Tusrata, who took the throne, was still a child. The Hittite king Suppiluliuma took advantage of this opportunity, attacked the Hurrians, and destroyed the Mitanni kingdom. After this defeat of the Mitanni, the Assyrians used the resulting chaos to rise up under the leadership of Eriba-Adad's son, Ashur-uballit, and broke free from Hurrian domination. Ashur-uballit's name would later become a symbol of courage and independence for Assyrian kings. It is no coincidence that the last Assyrian king took this name after the final destruction of the Assyrian kingdom in 612 BC. After gaining freedom, Ashur-uballit re-established international relations. He began to seal his letters to Egypt and Babylon as Sharu, or Sharu-rabu, which means great king. However, within his country, to maintain continuity with the past and traditional customs, he referred to himself as Uklum, which means leader. Ashur-uballit showed his respect to the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep IV by sending valuable gifts with his first letter. In his second letter, along with more gifts, he also requested gold for the new palace he was building in the capital, Ashur. After this, the pharaoh and Ashur-uballit became like brothers and continued to exchange gifts to maintain good relations. This event also demonstrated the growing influence and power of the Assyrians after gaining independence. Ashur-uballit was not satisfied with the newly gained independence and national sovereignty. He wanted to expand his territory by annexing some of the border regions that once belonged to the Mitanni kingdom. The region of Musri, where is present-day Jebel Maklub, northwest of Nineveh, came under Assyrian control this way. Babylon had previously viewed the Assyrian kingdom as secondary because of its past under Mitanni domination. To eliminate this difference and strengthen diplomatic ties, Ashur-uballit sent his daughter Muballit-Serua to marry the Babylonian king Burnaburiash in a grand wedding. While the Assyrians followed a militaristic and expansionist policy, Babylon was developing in the arts and sciences. In Babylon's temples, which were the scientific centers of that time, the foundations of astronomy, geography, and metaphysical philosophy were laid. Babylonian culture also influenced the Assyrians. The Assyrian king's chief scribe was Babylonian. A ziggurat was built in the capital, Ashur, to worship the Babylonian god Marduk, and it became fashionable among the Assyrians to create names combining the name of Marduk. After the death of his father, Karahardash, the son of the Assyrian princess, took the throne with a formal coronation ceremony. However, his reign was short-lived. Kassite nobles killed Karahardash and replaced him with Nadzibugash, another son of Burnaburiash from the Kassite line. Ashur-uballit rejected this and invaded Babylon with his army. He killed the new king and some of the nobles, placing his daughter's other son, Kurigalzu II, on the throne. After Ashur-uballit's death, Kurigalzu acted against the new Assyrian king, Enlil-Nirari, by supporting Kassite interests. In response, the Assyrians launched a new campaign against Babylon. After Kurigalzu was defeated in battle, the border between the two countries was redrawn to favor the Assyrians. As seen, the expansionist policy established by Ashur-uballit I was continued by his successors. Enlil-Nirari's son, Arik-den-Ilu, declared himself king and mighty king in his seals. Surviving records show that he led military campaigns in neighboring regions, spreading fear. In raids on the Nit-Gimhai region east of Assyria, war chariots were used, and the raids ended with the plundering of the region's grain and cattle. Arik-den-Ilu's son, Adad-nirari, described his father as a brave and heroic king who brought the people of the eastern mountainous regions under control. The Assyrian kings raided the nomads in the mountains, looted their goods, enslaved them, and forced them to work in Assyria. However, these nomads were also warriors. After each raid, they would strike back against Assyrian cities for revenge. For the first time, Adad-nirari crushed these nomads with brutal force, expanding the Assyrian borders as far as the Euphrates River. During this period, the Babylonian king Natsi-Marutash began expanding his kingdom through raids into northern Elam. The Assyrians were alarmed by Babylon's growing strength. Adad-nirari used a land dispute between the two countries as an excuse to attack Babylon and seize the contested territories. The borders between the two kingdoms were redrawn in favor of the Assyrians. The Mitanni kingdom, which was located around present-day Urfa and Mardin in southeastern Anatolia, was under Hittite protection. However, a conflict between the Hittites and Egypt around 1300 BC left Mitanni without protection. Adad-nirari seized this opportunity and invaded southeastern Anatolia with his army. He captured the Mitanni capital, Washukani, and took King Shatuara prisoner. Shatuara was later released in exchange for a large ransom. After Shatuara's death, his sons began fighting over the throne. Adad-nirari took advantage of the chaos, launched another invasion, destroyed the Mitanni kingdom, and annexed the territory from Carchemish to Tur-Abdin into Assyria. These conquests and expansionist policies created a wide buffer zone around Assyria, providing both influence and security. After these conquests, Adad-nirari began calling himself the Sharu-kishati, which means king of all lands. After defeating the Mitanni army in a major battle, he demanded that the powerful states of the time recognize his status and value as equal to theirs. The Hittite king Muwatalli responded to this demand with the following letter: "You won with your military strength and became a great king. But why do you keep talking about brotherhood? Were you and I born from the same mother?" This letter clearly shows Muwatalli's condescending attitude toward Adad-nirari. Adad-nirari not only held titles such as king, mighty king, and king of all lands, but also called himself the first among the armies and the brave representative of the gods. Like previous Mesopotamian rulers, he ruled the country and its people on behalf of the gods and was considered a semi-divine figure. He was the first king in history to claim that wars were initiated at the gods' command. This idea of using divine authority to justify expansionism began with him. After Adad-nirari, his son Shalmaneser I came to the throne and confronted the rising Urartu kingdom in the region around present-day Lake Van. The Urartians were defeated in just 3 days. Their capital, Arena, was destroyed and plundered. Strong Urartian children were separated and taken to the Assyrian palace. The quick success of the Assyrians suggests that the Urartians were still consolidating their strength at that time. Future conflicts between the two peoples were inevitable. After Urartu, Shalmaneser turned his attention to the Hurrians, who had separated from the Assyrian kingdom during Adad-nirari's reign. The Mitanni king Shatuara had strengthened his army with Hittite and Alamu allies. After the battle, Shalmaneser said, "With zeal and great intensity, my exhausted and thirsty soldiers approached the enemy. I reduced the enemy forces and inflicted a decisive defeat on them. I chased their king with my arrow until sunset. The lands captured were about the same size as the territory previously conquered by Adad-nirari, between present-day Diyarbakir and Tur Abdin. The Assyrians also captured the Haran Plain and the area around Carchemish. Shalmaneser followed his father's path and brought religion into warfare. He claimed to enter battles with the support of the god Ashur and other supreme gods. He described himself as the king who made all kings and princes kneel before Ashur and the other great gods. He said that he conquered Mitanni with the support of Ashur's power. Before launching a campaign, he followed an old tradition of consulting oracles and seeking guidance from Ashur through divination. Shalmaneser also used psychological warfare. His statement, "I slaughtered the Hittite and Alamu soldiers like sheep," aimed to spread fear among neighboring states and weaken enemy morale. Assyrian records from this period exaggerated the scale of their victories. According to Assyrian sources, 14,000 enemy soldiers were blinded, and 180 villages were burned during the war with the Hurrians. These exaggerated numbers and brutal actions were part of a psychological warfare strategy designed to intimidate enemies. Some historians attribute these acts of violence and mutilation to the inherent brutality of the Assyrians. However, similar punishments, such as cutting off hands, were common in the ancient Near East. In Nutsi, priests would order blinding as punishment for breaking a contract. The Amorites of Palestine would threaten to blind the right eye of their neighbors, the Yabeans. However, the first recorded instance of mass blinding of war prisoners was under Shalmaneser. His goal was to reduce enemy fighting strength and spread fear through the sight of blinded soldiers returning home. Shalmaneser also justified this violence by giving it a religious dimension. During his reign, warfare increasingly became a sacred duty, sanctioned by the gods. The god Ashur began to lead Assyrian armies into battle. After this period, Ashur became the god of war and was seen as equal to the great god Enlil. Shalmaneser took this idea even further. Enlil's wife was recorded in inscriptions as Ashur's wife. The god, the city, and the country all shared the name Ashur, creating a strong sense of unity. However, tensions and conflicts between the Assyrians and neighboring peoples increased. Except for Babylon, the Assyrians viewed all other neighboring peoples as barbarians, regardless of their distance or relationship. A new feeling of inferiority began to develop in the Assyrians' relationship with Babylon. While the Assyrians were constantly at war, Babylon was developing its arts and culture, which influenced the Assyrians. Sacred cities like Nippur, Sippar, and Uruk were part of the Babylonian kingdom. Babylon's chief god, Marduk, was highly respected and admired by Assyrian priests and nobles. A few years after Tukulti-Ninurta became king, he attacked Babylon and destroyed the city. This increased the sense of guilt and inferiority among the Assyrians. However, Babylon was blamed for the conflict, and the responsibility for the war was placed on Babylon. Before capturing Babylon, the Assyrians had to annex several smaller kingdoms and eliminate many local rulers. They not only reclaimed lands that once belonged to them, but also brought new peoples under Assyrian control. Tukulti-Ninurta expanded and completed the political structure established by Ashur-uballit I. This system was based on military organization and the army. However, the Assyrians had little cultural influence over the regions they conquered. Once the Assyrian army left a conquered region, Assyrian influence quickly disappeared, like snow melting under the sun. The strategy of leaving military commanders and governors to control occupied territories often provoked resistance from the local population. Frequent rebellions were difficult to suppress. As a result, the Assyrians chose to impose taxes on many kingdoms rather than directly controlling them. They also used the armies of these vassal states in future wars. The Assyrian kings exaggerated the number of enemies they killed, blinded prisoners, and brutalized neighboring peoples. After each victory, they had scribes and poets write victory songs and epic tales. However, the reality was different. The Assyrians faced the greatest challenges in the mountainous regions of Anatolia. When the Assyrian army approached mountain villages, the villagers either fled into the mountains or used their knowledge of the rocky terrain to resist. Assyrian soldiers often returned with nothing but a few cattle and sheep. The villagers only came down from the mountains after the Assyrians withdrew, and life resumed as before. Even in the plains, battles became more difficult. The local populations resisted more strongly, and Assyrian losses increased. Over time, the Assyrian kingdom became dependent on war and plunder. What was lost in one war had to be regained through new conquests. Wars were fought to meet the need for raw materials, creating a cycle of continuous conflict. The country's survival depended on new conquests and the resources gained from them. But these challenges were not the only problems the Assyrians faced. Over the years, some nomadic tribes that had lived beyond the Euphrates crossed the river and settled in the lands between the Euphrates and Tigris. Some of these tribes allied with the enemies of the Assyrians, while others paid taxes to the Assyrians. However, they often raided rich Assyrian cities and fled when the Assyrian army approached. Shalmaneser once said that the Gutians, one of these tribes, were as numerous as the stars in the sky. 10 years later, Tukulti-Ninurta defeated the nomads and, in his own words, filled the valleys and marshes along the banks of the Euphrates and Tigris with human corpses. The nomads were crushed under his rule. Early in his reign, he promised to bring destruction to the land of the Gutians. Because Tukulti-Ninurta believed that he was acting with the approval of the god Ashur, the Assyrian army fought with incredible bravery and defeated the nomads, even though the region was mountainous and difficult to navigate. The Gutian chief, Ubulli, was captured and exiled to Assyria. Afterward, he turned his attention to other nomadic tribes living in the Zagros Mountains. He forced the Gutians to cut down trees for building his new palace in Ashur. The Assyrians viewed trees with religious fear. Coming from Mesopotamia, where trees were rare, the Assyrians were awed by tall trees with leaves and fruits. They showed religious respect toward them. Tukulti-Ninurta raised his hands to the god Ashur and prayed while facing the Kurmuhu region, where is present-day Tur Abdin and Malatya. The Assyrian army's march through this region caused destruction similar to an earthquake. Villages and cities were burned and destroyed. Assyrian soldiers took the villagers as captives and sent them to Assyria. Through this campaign, the rich copper mines of Ergani came under Assyrian control. Ebli-Teshub, the king of Alzi, fled with his followers to an unknown kingdom in central Anatolia, possibly seeking refuge with the Hittites. After this event, the official historians of the state began using the term Pulutu when writing about the king's victory. This word means shining light. Historians claimed that the Assyrian kings released a kind of energy during battle, which caused their enemies to be weakened and defeated. During this period, the Assyrian kingdom expanded from the banks of the lower Zab River to the Euphrates, including the entire region that once belonged to the Mitanni kingdom. The northern and eastern areas of this region were also brought under Assyrian control. A few years later, Tukulti-Ninurta annexed a large part of the Nairi region, located west of Lake Van. However, as mentioned earlier, the Assyrians were not able to maintain control over these territories for long. Even though their military was highly skilled, they lacked the ability to govern effectively. In fact, culturally, they were less advanced than the local populations they conquered. Soon, the focus shifted to Babylon. The wealth and splendor of the cities in southern Mesopotamia had long tempted the Assyrian kings. In the 11th year of his reign, Tukulti-Ninurta attacked Babylon, captured the city, and took the Babylonian king Kashtiliash prisoner. He also took the statue of Marduk, Babylon's chief god, and brought it to Assur. In a tablet discovered during excavations, Tukulti-Ninurta described this event as follows: "With the help of the great gods leading my army, my lords Ashur, Enlil, and Shamash, and with the support of Ishtar, the goddess of the earth and sky, I confronted Kashtiliash, the king of Karduniash, to start the war. I forced his troops to surrender, and I made his warriors cut grass and weeds. In the middle of the battle, I personally captured the Kassite king Kashtiliash. I kicked his noble backside as if he were a donkey, chained him, and brought him to Assur, to my lords. I extended my power to the borders of Sumer and Akkad, to the lower sea where the sun rises, and I expanded my kingdom's borders." After the war, the Kassites were relocated to Kalhu in Assyria. Forcibly moving local populations to foreign regions had started during the reign of Shalmaneser. Shalmaneser had previously relocated the people of the Haran Plain to the south and forced them to build the walls of the city of Assur. According to the records, many Kassites who were settled in Nimrud died due to food shortages. After the fall of Babylon, Tukulti-Ninurta expanded his rule to the Euphrates River. The small kingdoms of Mari, Rapiku, and Hana, as well as the mountainous regions of southeastern Anatolia, including Arapha, where is modern Kirkuk, recognized Assyrian authority and began paying tribute. Tukulti-Ninurta's expansionist and regional dominance policies not only secured raw material resources for Assyria, but also provided new laborers and slaves. The annual taxes collected from the conquered kingdoms became an important source of income for Assyria. The copper and iron from Anatolia, the silver from the Taurus Mountains, and the timber from the Amanus and Zagros Mountains were used to build new palaces, government buildings, and tall ziggurats. However, the wealth gained from these conquests only benefited the Assyrian kings, state officials, nobles, temple priests, and oracles. The common people of Assyria, as well as the oppressed and exploited conquered peoples, remained under pressure and hardship. The Assyrian policy of domination created an atmosphere of fear in neighboring regions. The burning and destruction of villages and cities, along with the execution and enslavement of people, fueled this fear. Tukulti-Ninurta built 2 new temples in Assur. One of these, a ziggurat dedicated to the god Ashur, had been started during the reign of Shalmaneser, but was left unfinished. The old and small Ishtar temple was expanded and replaced with a larger and taller temple. Excavations and decoded tablets show that Assur became an important capital during Tukulti-Ninurta's reign. He also linked his name to religious and administrative organization, advancing beyond previous Assyrian rulers in this area. The new palace he built was part of the Ashur temple complex. Since wars were started under the guidance of the god Ashur, other cities and regions were also administratively linked to this temple. This complex was named Kar Tukulti-Ninurta. In reality, It was nothing more than a newly built palace complex from which the king ruled the kingdom. It was located about 3 kilometers south of the city, at the site of modern-day Tulul-Akir village. The king gave great importance to this new palace. He removed the cedar columns from the palace within the city and had them installed in his new palace. These columns had a long history. They were originally taken from the city of Nabur in the Haran plain by Adad-nirari after a campaign against the kingdom of Hanigalbat. The columns had once supported the palace of the king of Hanigalbat. Thus, the new palace became the king's residence and the center of Assyrian power. As Assyrian strength increased, the palace and temple complex expanded and became wealthier. In one section of the palace, a cult hall contained a throne on which the god Ashur was believed to sit once a year. Several times a year, the king hosted feasts in the palace and temple, where the gods were believed to be his guests. The most famous of these feasts was the Tukulti festival, celebrated after the king offered a sacrifice to the gods. The festival originated during the reigns of Adad-nirari and Shalmaneser. It was also celebrated in other Assyrian cities, where sacrifices were made to the gods. The Tukulti festival lasted several days, with the king playing a leading role. Morning and evening sacrifices were made by the king, while the priests managed the ceremony. After the chief priest listed the names of the gods being honored, he prayed for the success and good fortune of the city, the kingdom, and the king. The goal of these ceremonies and festivals was to ensure that the gods supported the king and to strengthen the king's control over both his people and neighboring nations. During this period, the king was known as the Son of all peoples. The Assyrians are believed to have adopted this title from their Hittite neighbors. However, Hammurabi had also called himself the Son of Babylon on the famous stele of his laws 500 years earlier. Therefore, it is likely that the Assyrians borrowed the concept of sun worship from both the Hittites and the Babylonians. The Assyrians showed the same respect to the sun god Shamash as they did to the war god Ashur. The Babylonians believed that the sun increased a person's ability to think and trade, helping to develop laws and the economy. On the other hand, the Assyrians saw the sun as a source of energy for their warrior lifestyle and a force that strengthened their ability to destroy. To the Assyrians, the sun also represented fire, and they believed they could control the regions they conquered by burning them down. Shamash, the sun god, was also the god of Sippar, a city that Tukulti-Ninurta had captured and added to Assyria. After this, Tukulti-Ninurta was known as the King of Sippar and Assur. This increased Shamash's influence and respect among the Assyrian people. After Tukulti-Ninurta's death, his successor Ashur-uballit I faced a serious flood when the Tigris River overflowed and threatened the city. In desperation, he raised his hands in prayer to the gods Ashur and Shamash, asking for their help. The Assyrians would swear oaths to the sun god Shamash when making trade agreements to guarantee their honesty and the security of the deal. After the fall of Babylon and the capture of the Babylonian king Kashtiliash, the Assyrian poets wrote an epic about this event. It was clearly written to justify the Assyrians' attack on Babylon. According to the epic, the gods decided to punish Babylon because Kashtiliash had broken a sacred oath. The highest divine powers turned their backs on Babylon and abandoned Marduk's temple. In the story, Tukulti-Ninurta's men came across some Babylonian merchants carrying a letter from Kashtiliash. Tukulti-Ninurta presented the letter to the god Shamash and complained that the Babylonian king had broken his oath. The epic repeated the idea that Kashtiliash's dishonesty had caused the war. At first, the Assyrian king appeared sympathetic toward the Babylonians, but his commanders pressured him, saying that the deceitful Babylonian king had to be removed. When the war began, the Assyrian gods marched at the front of the Assyrian army. This divine support helped the Assyrians win the war, and the spoils of victory were divided among the Assyrian gods. After Babylon fell under Assyrian rule, Babylonian religious beliefs and culture began to influence the Assyrian court. Tukulti-Ninurta continued to build new palaces and temples. The influence of the Babylonian god Marduk grew stronger within the Assyrian palace. However, the Assyrian priests and oracles, who were loyal to the Assyrian gods and whose power depended on them, became alarmed by the growing influence of Babylonian culture. They plotted against Tukulti-Ninurta and convinced one of his sons to kill him in his famous palace, Tukulti-Ninurta. Meanwhile, the Babylonians took advantage of the political chaos in Assyria. They drove out the occupying Assyrian forces and regained their independence.